Hello lovely people, welcome to another book chat, the regular but not monthly roundup of what I've been reading recently.
Doobie 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 Sophie Vlogs.
Don't know why we've got a dad to go with it now, but we do. So, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 books to talk about this week. I'm just going to dive in. I'm going to start with a book which I don't have anymore because I returned it to the library, but I read The Power by Naomi Alderman for my work has started a book group. This was our first inaugural book group meeting. We talked about The Power. I had mixed feelings on it. I thought it was good. I thought there were some flaws. I really enjoyed having a book group discussion about it because I don't know, sometimes you have more to, well, I don't know about you, but sometimes I have more to say about something when it's given me conflicting feelings than when I feel like wholly good about it or something. So like, I enjoyed hearing everyone else's opinions as well. So The Power is about one day women develop the ability to sort of like electrocute people with their hands, a bit like electric eels. It's like an evolutionary thing. They've got this skein here now, and like younger women can awaken the power in older women, and then the narrative looks at a number of years and sort of like a global reach, following a couple of individual people, looking at how that changes, like the world. But also, that narrative is framed within a larger narrative, which is emails and stuff from these two scholars, and that shows like a world in which like, sort of like a matriarchal society, I guess, so like, a lot of this rhetoric to do with like how women in academia are talked to and treated is like flipped on its head, and now it's the woman who is saying patronising things to the man. And then, so the implication being that this story narrative we've had is this book that this man has written. First of all, so Atwoodian, and I don't want that to be a reductive thing. I don't want to be like, oh, it's just like Margaret Atwood, because it's not. It's got its own things going on, but specifically, the book opens with a quotation to do with Samuel from the Bible, which is key to the text. It has a place in the text, and Margaret Atwood, when she features quotations at the start of the text, usually have something quite vital to say about what's going on, or they mean something. They're not just like setting the tone or something, they like have a relevance, which was interesting. And then this framing of this narrative within a narrative within these emails, that felt so Atwoodian to me, like the end of The Handmaid's Tale, when they have, like, I can't remember the specifics now, it's been a while since I read it, but there's like archaeologist notes or something at the end of it. There's this framing of this narrative, and then at the end of it calling into question how much of you read is true. Like, is this a true story in this universe? Is it a fabrication that is inspired by like historical artifacts, like all this stuff? So like, from a form standpoint, I found it very interesting. I think it was just, it also had that sort of bleak attitude, which I think Margaret Atwood sometimes has. Like, this is very much, you think it's called The Power because it's like, oh, women, they have electrical powers now, but actually, like, this is a study in power, in achieving power, in the corrupting influence of power, some maybe, but also just like every single viewpoint we have in the power, whether it's the politician, the crime lord's daughter, the religious, like, prophet side type thing. Like, it seems like it's a study on how do you achieve power, how do you maintain power. And we talked about in my book group, we talked around, like, what do we think? This is not an empowering book necessarily, because, like, none of these people, although you might start off rooting for them, by the end of it, the things they are doing are not things that you root for. But also, maybe we're looking, what does this tell us about power, was sort of our talking point question. And sort of the point that we ended up discussing is maybe it's about power and complicity. Maybe it's about these people who, if you let something continue far enough, it becomes very hard to change the system. Whereas if you take a stand earlier on and you say no, and you decide to stand your ground and hold your principles, it might go terribly for you, but equally you have a better chance of stopping things from progressing to such a point than you do if you don't take a stand, that if you go with the flow, that if you just follow along and that sort of thing. So we talked about maybe ideas of like complicity with power, and I don't know. I don't know how to have this conversation without doing more spoilers, but suffice to say, lots of things to think about. I don't think it's a perfect book. I think sometimes I liked that it had a global look because that was interesting, but also sometimes because we're skipping time and because we're looking so big, sometimes, I don't know, there was like a lack of connection sometimes to certain plot lines, stuff like that. And again, I'd like to think that maybe it wouldn't be so bleak. I don't know. There's lots of talking points. Very much a good book club book, I think, because we've had a lot to talk about. People had different reading experiences. Everyone, on the whole, thought it was good, but also were not sure if they would read anything. These sorts of things, discussions. But suffice to say, interesting chats were had. Moving on, I also read Enemies at Home by Lindsay Davies. This is the second book in the Flavia Alba Roman murder mystery stories. This is the same woman who did the Falco books, and Flavia Alba is his adopted daughter from Britain, originally living in Rome during the reign? Emperor Domitian. And this is a murder mystery. I liked this more than the first book because I didn't really get on with the first book. My issue, and it's in a book chat somewhere, I'll link it below, but my issue with the first book was I felt it was quite clear who the murderer was very early on, and it took a long time to catch up with it, and that annoyed me. This one I enjoyed more. There was more complexity. Essentially, in this one, a dude and his wife are murdered in their bed. Their slaves flee and try and claim sanctuary because the argument is, if Flavia can prove that the slaves would have heard what was happening and didn't go and help their owners, then they are culpable for the deaths. So Flavia has to investigate and look at, could these people have helped? Was it impossible for them to have helped? If it was impossible for them to have helped, then they'll go free. Well, free, some of them will be resold and bought again, the ones that weren't freed in the will. But essentially, so this one had a much more interesting moral debate at its centre, because we as modern readers look back at things like slaves, and that is not a good thing. Whereas to Roman life, that is everyday accepted. And this idea of how do you examine culpability, because partly as a modern reader, you hear this conundrum that Flavia is having to deal with, and you're just like, yeah, but like these guys have slaves, who cares if the slaves let them die? Like, they're slaves, let them be free. But then at the same time, this very much is taking place within Rome, and you have to abide by Roman law. So it was interesting to learn more about Roman law and to look at this murky conundrum of how much should these people have helped out, and could they have helped out, and culpability. Again, this culpability idea came into here. So I enjoyed this one a lot more. It's still not my favourite. It's still, the humour isn't quite my type of humour. There are moments which, like, I sort of, like, smirk, but it never makes me, like, laugh. But they're a perfectly fun murder mystery. I've got a couple more. They've been lent to me, so I've got a couple more to read, and I will definitely be reading the third one at some point. So more successful than the first time round. Next up is a non-fiction book, which I'm going to make a big, bold statement. This is one of my favourite non-fiction books I've ever read, ever, and I think it's objectively an incredibly well-written non-fiction book. That is How to Survive a Plague, the story of how activists and scientists tamed AIDS by David France. This was not always an easy read. This is, David France is a journalist. He was writing for newspapers like The Native and stuff like this in New York as the AIDS epidemic was developing, reaching its peak. So this is a really well done intermingling of facts and looking at scientists and activists who are involved in the AIDS crisis, in trying to find a cure, in trying to help victims, in trying to raise political awareness, that sort of thing. And also a deeply personal account of someone who was directly involved, knew the people involved in this movement, some better than others, but also lost people, and was absolutely someone who had the panic of getting tested and finding out which friends had come down with AIDS and stuff like that. So, like, as a understanding this moment narrative, I think this was incredibly well done. I think I get quite emotional about this book. I think it is very important that we don't forget what happened during the AIDS crisis. This is very much largely centred around New York, because that was where one of the largest outbreaks was, and also where a lot of the like stuff like ACT UP, stuff like this, New York based, sometimes it was quite a hard read because you have these scientists who are putting their absolute heart and soul into trying to find out what AIDS is, how do you help treat it, how do you cure it, and not even how do you treat AIDS. A lot of this is to do with making sure that because AIDS weakens your immune system, a lot of the cause of death was the secondary infections that resulted because you had such a low immune system tolerance. So even people who don't even have the time to even attack the process of how do you cure AIDS, it's how do we make sure that all of these secondary infections, which are leading to things like, which are leading to the diseases which are then actually killing people, how do you make sure that doctors are educated enough that they know how to treat those, because people are dying for easily preventable diseases because there is a lack of education, there is a lack of just like the sheer roadblocks that people came up against. I'm being so incoherent because it is enraging the level of obstruction that both activists and scientists were up against, and the lack of compassion that was coming from the Most High. Let's be honest, Ronald Reagan, piece of shit. These people who, just because this is a disease that is affecting gay people and they don't care about gay people, just do not give a shit about how many people are dying. And the unbelievable ability to fight and endure that is coming from activists who themselves are suffering from this disease and yet are rallying and are organising political movements. And of course none of the movements are perfect because people aren't perfect and people can't agree on the right way to combat these things and what's more important, education, supporting those who've been diagnosed, like fighting towards getting a cure, like all of these things. I just have come away with, number one, a much better, more thorough understanding of what was involved in tackling this, and also an appreciation for all of the people who fought so hard to try and make a difference, and they did make a difference. Nowadays, AIDS is not a death sentence. There are drugs that mean that you can continue a completely normal, healthy life, and that is wonderful, but it took too long to get there, and there were too many people and organisations who were obstructing it every step of the way, and that's a tragedy. And that's why, God, Sophie, didn't intend on getting so emotional doing this review, but I think that's why it's so important that we remember these stories, and we don't let these people be forgotten, and we don't let their fight be forgotten. And especially today, when people go, oh, but everything's so much better, we, as part of this community, things are better, but also they could be better, and sometimes you have to fight to make them better, and I think that's important to remember. And I'm going to stop talking now because I'm getting too emotional about this book. But suffice to say, it was really brilliant, and yes. Back onto books and away from me getting overly emotional about historical, I also read one of BookTube's favourites, Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. This is the first book of the Grishaverse, which is sort of kind of Russian-inspired fantasy. This is the first book of the Shadow and Bone trilogy. I also own Six of Crows, which is the first book of whatever that one is called. I'm going to be honest with you. Didn't love this one. Didn't hate this one. Didn't find it the most engaging. More excited to read Six of Crows, because a lot of people who didn't love this one do love Six of Crows, and I've heard a lot about how her writing style gets more engaging and the characters become more interesting. Essentially, I perfectly enjoyed reading this. None of the main characters particularly, I don't feel like I have really connected to them. They don't feel super fleshed out to me. Both, like, Alina and Mal are perfectly fine, but I don't have like a big emotional connection to them. The Darkling, I'm just sort of like, you seem like a bit of a shit. Yeah. There are a couple of side characters in this that I find really interesting. I think it's Bagra, is that her name? I've got so much about this one, I've forgotten all people's names in this book. Essentially, some interesting concepts and threads. I think if I'm going to continue this, I'm going to continue it by getting it out of the library. I don't feel like this is going to be a book series that I'm going to want to own. That said, still quite hyped to dive into Six of Crows, see what that's like. And I've heard a lot of people acknowledge that, like, Leigh Bardugo's writing style gets better because she grows as a writer, and I'm here for writers growing and coming into their own. Great, I like that. So, like, I think maybe the hype made me have higher expectations than I should have going in, but I didn't dislike it. Okay, I have 2 books left and then we're done. We'll go with a small graphic novel next. That is Under the Moon, A Catwoman Tale by Myracle, illustrated by Isaac Goodheart. This is part of, I think DC has done this series which is specifically designed for teenagers, and it's sort of like rebooting the origin stories of some of their superheroes. I'll be honest with you, I have a similar problem with this that I also had with Mira Tidebreaker, which was the other one of this series that I read. They're just a little bit predictable. So much happens in this, but also nothing really happens in this. It's re-zhuzhing Selina Kyle's origin story. But it's not really doing anything special. Like, I feel conflicted because it's not actively bad, but it just also wasn't actively good. You know, I just felt like characterizations were quite wishy-washy. A lot of plot happens, but also it feels like a lot of the plot was sort of extraneous and didn't really matter because it hasn't really had much point to it. I don't know, maybe if it had just been a bit longer, if it had taken a bit more time to consider each plot point, maybe I would have liked it more. It felt kind of a bit rushed, but also at the same time, like, rushing towards what? I don't know. I feel a bit conflicted about it. I didn't love it. I think I gave it 2 stars because I thought it wasn't horrendous. For me, like, a 3-star rating is a solid, good, enjoyable book. A 2-star rating is a book that is not bad, but also I have conflicting feelings about, and I don't think it's done particularly well. A 1-star book is like, I hate this book, it's terrible. But, yes. That, again, God, I feel like since I talked about the non-fiction book, I've really gone downhill. Finally, I'm going to end on some poetry. This is Answering Back, edited by Carol and Duffy. This is contemporary poets and respond to poems that have been important to them in their life and stuff. As with all anthologies, I obviously responded to some better than others. I'm going to sort of go through and talk about a couple of highlights from this. One that I just want to mention is Tony Curtis responded to Allen Ginsberg's Howl, and Tony Curtis's is called Trowel, and just says, "I have seen the best minds of my generation destroyed by DIY," and I just thought that was quite funny. But essentially, you have the original poem here, who it's by, the poem, and then the person who's picked it, and then their response. I thought some of these were much better done than other ones, but that's just my own personal taste. For example, one of my favourite poets is C.P. Cavafy, and one of his most famous poems is Ithaca. Theo Dorgan did a response to that called Ithaca 4, which is for Leonard Cohen, and I felt like that was a really lovely way of sort of, it has like a very similar like style and writing, and it really captures a mood, but also like in a contemporary, up-to-date kind of way. I also really particularly enjoyed Owen Shears did a response to John Donne's To His Mistress Going to Bed, and he did To Her Husband Going to Bed. To His Mistress Going to Bed is quite like a filthy John Donne poem, but To Her Husband Going to Bed is written from the point of view of John Donne's wife, and she suffered a number of miscarriages and that sort of thing, and it's sort of the looking at her response to that poem, and sort of this tying it into this wish for a child. The pressures on a woman to provide children to their husband, and what it must have been like to be a woman in that time who keeps having miscarriages and stuff like that. Like, I felt like it was quite a compassionate look at that, which was really interesting. Equally, again, Lucille Clifton's The Lost Baby poem, Claire Shaw did a response called The No Baby poem. Again, this way of universal subjects sometimes, I think. I think some of my favourite ones of these dealt with universal subjects, and no matter when the original poem was written, the response sort of shows that, makes it much more modern, but also still universal, this way that there are certain themes which poetry draws on, which we keep drawing on, which we won't ever stop drawing on, and how that's still relevant to us today. I think those are my favourite ones, is ones that really felt, I don't know. I also really liked Menna Elfin did responded to David ap Gwilym's The Clock with A Dream Against the Clock, which I also thought was particularly good. I don't know, it was a good anthology, I think. I think on the whole I quite enjoyed it. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars because I think rating anthologies is really hard, because you're like, some of these I would give 5 stars to the poem, some of them I'd give 1 star because I didn't like them. That's the nature of anthologies, but as anthologies go, I actually really enjoyed doing this one. I think it's a really great way of also getting people who either want to find more contemporary poets, that's my case, I am familiar with a lot of the poems that they're drawing on, but I wanted to learn about more contemporary poets, but equally, if you're someone who's really into contemporary poetry, this is a great way to find out more older poetry, more established poetry, so I think that's a really great idea. That's everything. I feel like this might have been a hefty book chat. I've gone places, I've been emotional, I've also been disappointed. We've really, gone full circle today. As per usual, I would love to hear from you. Have you read any of these books? Do you have any responses to any of these books? The usual, have you been reading anything great recently? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, I'm going to go now. I've got a bit of a cold. I don't know if you can hear it, but I think I need to go. It's I don't know, how to recover from all these emotions. I hope you're having a really lovely day. I will see you next week with something different.